Well, Gypsy Rose Blanchard went on a podcast called We Need to Talk. It was a We Need to Talk podcast with this man, Paul Brunson. Now, mind you, this podcast was released today, and this is disgusting. Today is the anniversary of Gypsy's crime. What a day to release this podcast full of lies. It's so clear to see this man, Mr. Brunson, did zero research. He did not look at one FOIA document, zero medical records. This man, he didn't look at any of the videos between her and Nicholas Goatjohn. Nothing. This man did not do any research. If I had to guess, he probably watched a couple of the documentaries, maybe the Mommy, Dead, and Dearest, and whatever the other one was. That was probably the extent of this man's research. This podcast was disgusting. It was like 2 hours and 19 minutes. And I watched the whole thing. And when I say it angered me because it is so full of lies. Gypsy is still trying to trash talk her dead mother. Mind you, on the anniversary of her crime. I mean, I know that's not when it was filmed, but she knew that was the day that this podcast was going to drop. So let's talk about it. I might have to do this in two separate videos because, like I said, it was a 2 hour and 19-minute podcast. So I'd have to break this down into a couple parts. And I got my notes here if you see me, because there was a lot. When I say lies, there was so many lies I found in this. Gypsy Rose should be ashamed of herself, and so should Mr. Paul Brunson. If you're going to interview someone, at least do your research first. Yeah, I believe going there with an open mind, but look at both sides of it before you just go in there believing all these lies and, treating her and going at her with the kid gloves on. No, ask the hard questions, sir. So anyways, the first thing I found funny is, she starts talking about her early childhood. Up until the age of 5, things were pretty good because her grandmother was still alive. But, things kind of fell apart after her grandmother passed. And then Gypsy and Dee Dee lived with Dee Dee's father. So Gypsy's grandfather. Anyways, Gypsy talks about supposedly Dee Dee had been diagnosed bipolar. Now, I don't recall ever hearing this before. I don't recall seeing this anywhere or hearing this. I could be wrong, though, because, there's so much to this case. So, there's a whole lot that bits and pieces I could have missed. But I don't recall ever hearing before that Dee Dee was bipolar. Gypsy said she can remember that Dee Dee was on medication for bipolar disorder, and a therapist used to come to the house to have therapy sessions with Dee Dee. Now, I've never heard of therapists making house calls, but maybe because she had a sick child, I don't know, but I don't believe there to be any truth to that at all. I don't believe there's any truth to that at all. So Gypsy says that growing up, Dee Dee would always say to Gypsy, "Did you hear that? Did you see that?" She claims that Dee Dee was having both visual and auditory hallucinations. She was seeing and hearing things. And she claims that Dee Dee would get upset with her when Gypsy would say, "No, Mama, I don't see anything. I don't hear anything." And like I said, I don't recall ever seeing or hearing that before, that Dee Dee was bipolar. Or I don't recall Gypsy ever even saying that before. But anyways. And Paul says, he kind of says, so Dee Dee was isolating Gypsy, and of course Gypsy's going to agree with this. She was isolated her whole life. She wasn't allowed to do anything, except go on all these nice trips and everything and meet celebrities, but she wasn't allowed to do anything. So Gypsy says she remembers, I do remember her talking about this before, about the time she says she seen her mom in the bathtub, the clawfoot tub, here we go with that again, and she's seen her grandpa washing Dee Dee in the tub. And then Dee Dee put Gypsy in the tub, and the grandpa washed her and was exposing himself to Gypsy, so Gypsy says. Then when Gypsy was 9, she says that it was after a bad car accident. And I believe this is when Dee Dee hurt her ankle. So Dee Dee was in the hospital, and somebody needed to watch Gypsy. So Gypsy's grandfather watched her, and at this time is when the grandfather molested Gypsy. So Gypsy says the grandfather has denied these allegations. Now, I don't remember ever hearing Gypsy say this before either. I remember the story about the bathtub and Gypsy saying he exposed herself or himself to her, but I don't recall her ever saying that he actually molested her. Maybe she did claim that before. I don't know. But then she says when she was older, she had told her mother that this happened. And Dee Dee asked her some specific question, and Gypsy said, yes, this happened. And supposedly Dee Dee began to cry. And then Gypsy walked it back. But then Dee Dee admitted that she was also molested by her father. So I'm going to have to go through a lot of these FOIAs and see if I can verify this, but I don't recall Gypsy ever saying before that she was actually molested by the grandfather. Gypsy also said by this time they got to talking about doctors, okay? And Gypsy says that Dee Dee was spinning a story to these doctors saying Gypsy was paralyzed from birth. And Dee Dee was telling everyone that Gypsy was paralyzed from birth. I don't recall ever seeing that in any of the medical records either, because the story that it's always been is Gypsy had a seizure during a surgery. I believe it was an eye surgery. She had a seizure and then she was temporarily paralyzed. I don't remember ever hearing her say that Dee Dee was saying she was paralyzed from birth, because that would have been very easy to disprove. I mean, we've seen the videos of Gypsy in a little cheerleading outfit. You know, we've seen all kinds of videos of Gypsy walking around as a small child. So to say Gypsy was telling people that Gypsy was paralyzed from birth, I'm not buying that. Then she claims after they had moved out from the grandfather's house, they went to the Ronald McDonald house to live, because Gypsy was going back and forth to a lot of doctor's appointments. So at that time, she believes it was about $5 a day to stay at the Ronald McDonald house. And she claims that Dee Dee became close with one of the doctors, and that Dee Dee was actually even buying gifts for this doctor in exchange for this doctor to put in the medical records what Dee Dee wanted this doctor to put in the medical records. I don't recall ever hearing anything like that either. I mean, so where are these stories coming from? These are lies. Because this is the first we're hearing of these. We had never heard about Dee Dee buying gifts for a doctor, so the doctor would put in the medical records what Dee Dee wanted. And then we hear about Dr. Flaberstein, I don't recall. He was the doctor who, in the office, asked Gypsy to stand up, and Gypsy does not remember this, but she thinks that maybe she did stand up. And she claims that after that time, I do recall this story, that after that time, that is when Dee Dee got even more strict about these doctors and not letting Gypsy talk to the doctors. Now, Gypsy claims she told Paul that there was never any physical abuse. Dee Dee was never physically abusive to her. Now, how many times have we heard Gypsy say that her mother hit her, was restraining her, physically restraining her, and this and that, but now Gypsy's walking it back saying, no, I was never physically abused by my mother. Another lie. But you see, she's going to contradict herself in this interview, because she's going to change the story again from now, no, there was no physical abuse, to yes, there was. I don't know. That's probably about the first 45 minutes of the podcast. So we'll get into more in part 2.